in a quick introduction to the two of you, and brief. Perrine, and I apologize ahead of time if I do too much violence to your names. If I grew up with you, I'd probably have the right pronunciation down. But Perrine Toledano is the head of mining and energy at the Columbia Center on Sustainable Investment, the Earth Institute at Columbia University, and Dietrich Brauch is Associate Research Scholar at the Columbia Center on Sustainable Investment at the Earth Institute as well. We are really looking forward to your presentation. Thank you for being here. Elena said we would really enjoy what it is, not enjoy, be informed by what it is you have to say. And I'm really looking forward to it. So thank you for being here.
Thank you very much. I can take it from here and start our presentation. You've actually very helpfully, saved me from introducing ourselves, so we can jump right onto it. Both Perrine and I are at the Columbia Center on Sustainable Investment, which is a joint center here at the Columbia Law School and the Earth Institute at Columbia University. We're a leading applied research center dedicated to sustainable international investment. And our mission in the center is to develop and advance policies and practices that shape investment in a way that it contributes to rather than undermines sustainable development. So moving on to our outline here, this is the outline of the roadmap of the study that we will present, but today we will focus on just a few of the elements. I'll present the introduction and the vision of our report, and then we'll focus on the findings and recommendations for centralized, decentralized energy planning, which Perrine will present. And then we will focus on the phase out of fossil fuels, which I will present. Perrine will then look at the financing imperatives and challenges related to section 4, and then she will wrap up by outlining recommendations. Our report sets out a comprehensive and actionable roadmap for Africa to transform its energy system into a zero carbon energy system by 2050, with most advances achieved by 2030 in line with the Paris Agreement goals. Natural resource management, minerals, fossil fuels, and land sits at the core of our strategy. And our starting point is that all Africans, whether they're living in urban areas or rural areas, will need access, and already do need access, to affordable, clean, efficient, reliable, climate-proof, and renewable energy for both residential and productive uses, in order for Africa to achieve its sustainable development objectives. Our vision is, first, that the world economy is going to decarbonize, and Africa will be an important part of this trend. Second, Africa will need to front load its investments in green electrification, in digitalization of the economy, borrowing at concessional rates for both green and digital investments. Third point in our vision, the international community, guided by the African Union, should dramatically increase the capacity of the African Development Bank and other African banks to front load those investments. And fourth point in our vision, Africa should use its vast continental resources in renewable energy and strategic minerals for the energy transition, biodiversity, human skills, in order to develop productive capacity in the renewable energy supply chain. Our focus in this report on zero carbon electrification is based on an assumption that by 2050, economy-wide energy demand from households and the productive sector, including industry, transportation, buildings, cooking, all of it will be overwhelmingly met with renewables-based electricity. And renewable and synthetic fuels will supply any remaining fuel demand, entirely displacing fossil fuel use. Moving on to the next one, here are 4 structural changes that are assumptions at the basis of our report on Africa's energy transition. First, urbanization. The urbanization rate is expected to reach around 59% by 2050 because of the significant rise in agricultural productivity, the promotion of urbanization as a part of Africa's development strategy. Higher urbanization will lower the costs of energy services and facilitate electrification. Second structural change, the demographic transition. The fertility and mortality rates will continue to decline in Africa, accelerated by urbanization and education. And that in turn will slow down the population growth rate while increasing the proportion of the population at working age. And this will then create a demographic dividend of economic growth and poverty reduction. Third structural change, industrialization. Industry's share of GDP in Africa will rise, supported by massive digital access and a skilled workforce to seize opportunities in the digital and renewable economy. And economic growth is another structural change. Annual growth per capita GDP should reach at least 7% per decade, meaning it would double per capita income each decade. The growth rate here is comparable to that that was achieved by China in the 80s, 90s, 2010s, and up to 2020, and it should be based on the same principles of China's supercharged growth rates. High rates of investment in infrastructure, education, and business capital. Now moving on to renewable energy potential and access to electricity in Africa. Africa represents less than 10% of the global share of oil production. But at the same time, it accounts for 39% of global technical solar and onshore and offshore wind potential, besides the geothermal potential in the East Africa Rift system. Solar and wind potential in Africa is 100 times greater than current energy demand for most North African countries and in South Africa, and 1,000 times greater than demand in most of sub-Saharan Africa, solar and wind potential. So these figures on Africa's potential are in stark contrast with the low access rates to electricity in much of sub-Saharan Africa. In this context, and you can see this in the map here, this context is what justifies the ambition of our roadmap of bringing zero carbon electrification to all Africans. And I'll go to the next slide and pass it on to Perrine here for the next one.
Yeah, thanks, Martin. Yeah. So the 3 components of our proposed strategy for Africa's zero carbon electrification are first, centralized energy infrastructure, second, decentralized energy infrastructure, and third, the phase out of fossil fuels on economic grounds. I'm giving here an overview of these components, starting with the centralized infrastructure. Centralized infrastructure is needed to meet the energy needs of urban populations, industrial users, and the transport sector, whether it's directly for electricity or indirectly for the production of synthetic fuels. It is made of the trunk infrastructure, meaning utility scale renewable energy projects, transmission and distribution networks that are digitized and interconnected at national and international levels, and third, energy storage facilities that do include gas for now as a stopgap measure. It is also made of networks of charging stations and other infrastructure needed for electric vehicles to transport passengers and cargo. Let me insist here on the importance of interconnection. Interconnection of grids in Africa and even worldwide is critical for the following 4 reasons. First, it enables taking advantage of the complementarity of renewables energy profiles on the chart, you can see the complementarity of the hydrological profiles of two rivers supporting hydroelectricity in Africa. Second, interconnection enables leveraging the comparative advantage of each country in terms of demand profile and supply. Interconnection reduces the off-taker risk for independent power producers in Africa, and on the continent, unfortunately, this risk is quite high. Four, interconnection enables tremendous cost savings because it limits the necessity to invest in energy storage and generation. Next slide, Martin, please. A quick word on digitization. Many national grids are not ready for renewable energy integration and are operating close to their voltage limit with frequent load shedding. To this end, it is necessary to plan for a switch to digitization, enabling smart grids that integrate smart operation and control, multi-renewable energy complement, storage, contingency reserves, and efficient utilization. For some countries, it will mean strengthening the broadband network first. While this is a heavy lump sum investment, it will deliver significant savings over time, as you can see from that chart on the slide. It's a little, the font is a little small, and there are a few details here, but you can consult it more closely after the presentation. Next slide, please, Martin. So how to finance the centralized infrastructure? The continent's mining sector is now on high demand by the green transition. At the same time, this mining sector is an energy-intensive activity that should provide what we call anchor demand for a robust energy system. Nascent but growing industries such as the production of aluminum, steel, cement, the setup of data centers, and the mechanization of agriculture also provide this anchor demand. In turn, an increasingly robust energy system will support Africa's industrialization, including industrialization in markets that will further strengthen the zero carbon energy system, the production of green hydrogen, the production and recycling of batteries, the making of and manufacturing of solar panels and wind turbines, and the information and communication technology sector, with all of this having the potential to serve both the domestic and the export markets. Unfortunately, this feedback loop between the mining sector and the energy system has seldom been taken advantage of in Africa. And this opportunity is now renewed in the context of the energy transition and shouldn't be missed. Next slide, please, Martin. There are, however, governance, institutional, and legal prerequisites to make all this work. First, upgrading the mining governance system. African countries are presenting with a second chance to get it right. Second, modernizing the electricity laws and energy planning frameworks to ensure the social and environmental sustainability of renewable energy siting, the liberalization of the generation sector through the penetration of independent power producers, and the financial and operational health of power utilities. So you have a little chart here. It basically shows the extent of the fiscal deficit of the power utilities in Africa. Next slide, please, Martin. So now moving into decentralized infrastructure. Decentralized energy infrastructure includes solar-based mini grids and solar host systems for the continent's rural and other remote areas, connecting 50% of the what we call the unplugged, which is about 30 to 40 million people per year. our 4 principles for the decentralized infrastructure is that they should be run by private companies, but organized, supported, and regulated by the public sector, the government and its agencies, based on a least cost approach to mobilize the cost-effective technological solutions, ensuring energy justice through meaningful and inclusive consultation and education, and meeting the twin goals of being affordable and profitable. Now I'm taking a closer look at point 2 and 4 on that slide. Martin, please, next slide. Electrification roadmaps developed by countries need to apply, again, what is called the least cost approach, leveraging the existing open source geospatial data tools, and mobilizing all technological solutions, meaning grid extension, mini grids, and solar home system. On the chart, you can see here an application by Togo. This cost optimization through the choice of technology is indispensable to minimize the cost of the deployment of the electricity system. And in turn, the amount of subsidies, of public subsidies, that will enable electricity access. Next slide, please, Martin. In addition, since the decentralized infrastructure should be run by the private sector, but targeting the poor, there is a need for a strong framework enabling both profitability and affordability of the system. As we said, it starts with a strong institutional framework providing direction and oversight. It involves leveraging mobile payments to finance energy as a service. It involves encouraging the electrification of co-productive uses and not only household needs. It involves facilitating data sharing between operators and between the government. Between operators, and between the government and operators. All of these tools should enable the rationalization of public sector intervention in the market to coordinate investment and limit the public expense. Martin, I'm now passing on to you.
Thank you so much, Perrine. I'll pick it up here. Now that we've heard about the need to invest in centralized and decentralized infrastructure, 2 of our core pillars in our report, I'm going to turn into the need to phase out fossil fuels. And our starting point is that the cost of production is not globally competitive in African oil producing countries. For example, in 2016, the estimated production cost in Algeria, over $20 per barrel, was more than twice the cost of production in Kuwait. The production in Angola and Nigeria were 3 times the cost in Saudi Arabia. Lower long-term oil prices and the diminishing role that fossil fuels will play in the global economy will tend to frustrate the expectation of other new oil producers in sub-Saharan Africa that rely on those projects that had high production costs. It may sound odd now to talk about lower oil prices given the current shock led by the war and aggression from Russia on Ukraine, but that, or the current shock, doesn't really change the long-term perspective in terms of where oil prices are going to go. So maybe companies may ultimately give up developing these pricey, high production costs reserves in Africa. For example, oil prices below $40 would put more than half of Uganda's potential oil production at risk. And prices between $40 and $60 in the long term would put 1/4 of its new projects at risk. Senegal's scenario is even worse. Its entire projected production would be at risk with prices between $40 and $60 in the long term. The energy transition will pose fiscal challenges to several African economies that are highly dependent on oil and gas earnings. Africa accounts for 9 of the top 40 countries in oil and gas revenues as a share of GDP, which are called the petrostates, that are very dependent, that are highly dependent on these revenues. The fiscal dependence of these 9 countries on oil and gas revenues ranges from 12 to 81% of average government revenue between 2015 and 2018. And this is why we talk about a phase out of fossil fuels in Africa. It's true that several African countries will continue to produce and export oil and gas by 2050. But as the world transitions away from fossil fuels and towards zero carbon energy, global prices for oil and gas are likely to go low again. Opportunities for fossil fuel exports will diminish, and then more economic opportunities are likely to arise from the declining costs of zero carbon energy as well. This is why, besides scaling up investment in zero carbon electrification, as Perrine was telling us about, our report urges Africa to also carefully consider the risks of failing to plan for a phase out of fossil fuel production and use by 2050. And Africa, it is our recommendation, it should also prepare for the decline in oil and gas export earnings and prepare for the global zero carbon energy transition. Increasing risks by 2050 will include a shortfall in fossil fuel export earnings, high cost access to electricity, lack of access to donor finance, continued social and environmental externalities from the production of fossil fuels, and stranded assets. Africa's successful phase out of fossil fuels will require action on several fronts, and we have a few recommendations here. First, adopting legal and policy frameworks that are conducive to the phase out of fossil fuels. It will be necessary for Africa to structure robust industrial and economic diversification policies to move their economies away from fossil fuel dependence. It will also be necessary to redirect oil and gas revenues towards diversification in zero carbon energy and zero carbon industry. It will also be important to avoid and minimize locking in more capital in coal, oil, and gas, and as well as important to avoid locking out zero carbon alternatives. Africa will continue its operational fossil fuel production and exports, but it will do so on a diminishing basis. Investment in new hydrocarbons in Africa should be restricted to those that are high quality, low cost reserves that can be profitably developed in the context of falling global demand and falling long-term prices. And Africa should refrain, is our recommendation, from additional exploration and infrastructure expansions that would be costly, particularly in coal and oil. And in terms of gas and gas-related infrastructure, there's a bit of nuance that we add here to the report. We advise planning gas and gas infrastructure investments carefully, limiting those investments to only those that will be necessary to provide flexibility to the energy system and feedstock for the industry. And at the same time, as these investments in gas persist, just while we're waiting for the cost reductions in storage solutions or and in low or zero carbon fuels for industrial activities. And at the same time, it will be important to consider the potential of green hydrogen and leveraging existing gas infrastructure to reduce stranded asset risks. Another important point is to remove the $53.5 billion worth of fossil fuel subsidies throughout the African continent. Also important to repurpose national oil companies by redirecting their activities towards zero carbon energy, away from oil and gas, and finally, cutting public financing for fossil fuel investment. It's necessary, it's important to align the lending policies of national banks, national development banks, and multilateral development banks and development finance institutions aligning their policies, their lending policies, with energy and climate policy goals. Thank you so much. I'll stop here and turn it back to Perrine for the next part.
Thanks, Martin. So we roughly established the financing need for zero carbon electrification of the continent by 2050, with major advances by 2030 to be about $136 billion per year, divided between power generation and power transmission and distribution. Most of this new power generation capacity should come from solar. If it comes from fossil fuel, which is still hard to fully avoid, as we discussed, as Martin explained, it should be calibrated to specific needs, such as bringing flexibility to the electricity system or providing feedstock to the industry. While significant, these new investments are affordable, as they represent, on average, 2% of the continent's annual GDP over the period, right? We're not talking about of today's GDP, but over the 30-year period. And this is actually where comes the main thrust of our argument, is that Africa's GDP can and should rise rapidly in the coming years, supported by front-loading investment in energy, digital services, and education. Because of this rapid growth, Africa can absorb large amounts of low interest, long maturity debt in order to finance the rapid scale-up of power generation and power distribution. Next slide, please, Martin. These financing needs stand in contrast with the current mobilization from the multilateral banks to build the zero carbon energy system in sub-Saharan Africa, which is about $2.3 billion per year. When you take into account co-finance, which is the other type of multilateral financing, plus the private sector, you add another $2.5 billion per year. The chart on the left shows that catalyzing private sector finance is now working only for the African Development Bank, but not at all for all the others. In addition, in 2019, only 6% of climate finance was coming through grants and 3% through guarantees. And according to the OECD, as of 2016, only 1/3 of loans are concessional, and actually as of 2022, it might be even worse. In other words, besides being 20 times insufficient and not crowding in the private sector, climate finance is high cost, short-term, and susceptible to generate debt default and liquidity crisis on the part of the African countries, worsening the chances for the continent to leverage the energy transition for electricity and energy access. Next slide, please, Martin. These charts here confirm the problem of misallocation of money. Overall, nearly $30 billion from the multilateral banks and the Development Financial Institution, DFI, went into the fossil fuel sector in the last 5 years. Next slide, please, Martin. To unlock the capital needs of actually the multilateral banks and the African development banks that are tied to what the donor countries require, we suggest a few things. Reviewing the rates of return donors require from the multilateral development banks and the DFI to secure more funding in pure grant form. Creating financing structure focused on providing high-risk capital to enable the participation of countries, donors, institutional investors. transparently analyzing whether the capital adequacy ratio could be lowered without compromising the AAA rating given by the credit rating agencies, contemplating relaxing the AAA rating. I can explain after the presentation if not everyone is clear about that rating. Doing these two measures that I just mentioned regarding the AAA rating could actually unlock billions of dollars for the continent. To finish, next slide, please, Martin. The report provides a roadmap for the decades to come, but also mentions immediate actions to make this happen. This action should be led by a leading continental institution, supported by an advisory group. And these actions fall under 3 categories: high-level policy strategies and public communications. For the sake of time, I'm not going to read what is on the slide, but you can check it later. Technical studies and reform of governance and legal frameworks. So I think we can end here, and Martin and I are very happy to open up to the audience and address any questions that you may have. Thank you very much again for having us.
Thank the two of you. Thank you very much. This was incredibly informative, useful, etc. It was exciting to hear some of this stuff. In fact, all of it. I have a few questions myself having to do with a couple of things that popped up. The way we want to handle this, as I indicated earlier, is that the participants will undoubtedly have some questions. They'll put them in the chat group, and I'll start asking them to you. But I'm going to, I need to ask a couple questions first. Let me get rid of this phone call. All right, so one is, you're asking to, you point out the need to repurpose the core industries of the current oil industry. And I'm curious what you might see as possible activities for them. You know, do they put themselves out of business, or do they, repurpose doesn't sound like going out of business. What else could they manage to segue to something that has more to do with building the green economy that gets electricity to everybody in that part of the world? Is there a role for the current fossil fuel industry in Africa?
Yes, thank you. This is a great question that we also try to understand, analyze, and write about. There are things that are closer to their business model, which is basically making and commercializing biofuel. It could also be taking advantage of their expertise in offshore operations for offshore wind. These are the two main things that are very close to what they are doing right now and mobilizing the same type of expertise. Obviously, there is a third thing but this is more about possibly preserving the operation of fossil fuel, which is investing a lot in R&D for carbon capture and storage, meaning that this kind of engineering project would prevent emissions from escaping to the atmosphere. And then the other avenue that they could take is basically diversifying into the electricity business. and many of them do, or the renewable energy business in general. The problem is that they're investing maybe 2% or 3% of the capex, and still nothing as compared to what they still invest in oil and gas. But many of them have, or they have a renewable energy unit, or they have investing in ventures in renewables. They're also investing in, they put their money into ventures and startup in electric vehicles, in batteries, in grid infrastructure, and so on. So they have part of them going into diversification already, part of them trying to use their current expertise and repurpose it for the green transition. Overall, none of this is still insufficient. Martin, you want to add something?
I just wanted to respond more provocatively to the question by saying, yes, we need to put them out of this business. They can still operate, but not in the oil and gas business that is unsustainable and that is destroying our climate system globally. So they have alternatives in which they can invest their capital expenditures. As Perrine says, they're now starting to claim that they're investing in renewable energy and green hydrogen and offshore wind, but that's still a very small portion of their capital expenditure. So they really need to ramp up their capital expenditure in non-oil and gas and investment activities or economic activities.
Thank you. That was a pleasantly provocative response, one that I personally would agree with. One of your proposals is to get rid of the 50-some billion in subsidies that are currently subsidizing the fossil fuel industry. How do you see pulling that off time-wise? I assume you're not talking about pulling that plug all at once, but gradually reducing that, or do you propose getting rid of it overnight?
Martin, you tell me if you want to start.
Sure, I can step in here if you'd like me to, Perrine. Our report doesn't simply say, pull the plug on all subsidies immediately. And I think the general discourse when it comes to fossil fuel subsidy reform is a phase out of fossil fuel subsidies, just as we talk in our report about a phase out of fossil fuel production and use. It's not a flip of a switch, pun intended, to just change an energy system entirely, and it's the same for fossil fuel subsidies. I think these discussions have to start somehow, and countries have to sit around international discussion fora, tables around these fora, and really come up with timelines and milestones that will have to be met, and how each country is going to approach the issue of fossil fuel subsidies. And I think there's a great role here for the African Union, perhaps also for the African Development Bank, to be to serve as the forum for these discussions and to provide the technical assistance that various countries across Africa will need to implement the progressive phase out. Not only phase out, but actually what other areas these subsidies will be redirected to, because there's also quite a bit of talk about the fossil fuel subsidies swap or subsidy swaps rather than subsidizing fossil fuels, and really redirecting those remaining energy subsidies to those who really need, rather than subsidizing production of fossil fuels, which ultimately benefits all types of consumers, both the rich and the poor. Why not direct subsidies to those users who really need, the poorest, the most vulnerable?
Segueing from my questions to the ones that have shown up in the chat box right now. First question is, how will we move to smart grids, to support local traditional livelihoods and emerging livelihoods in countries like Zimbabwe along the Zambezi River system? I don't know what particulars of that, but hopefully you might have some idea. What are the safeguards that will need to be put in place to involve and share benefits with local populations and prevent capital flight and prevent corruption and misallocation of fundings. I'm quite confident that in your report and research, you haven't covered everything under the sun, and there are going to be questions that come up that you didn't put in your report, in which case we're looking for your personal opinion based on what you do know about the world and this subject in particular. So if you could respond to that question, we'd appreciate it.
Yeah. No, I'd love to, and we'd love to, but I'm not completely sure what is meant. The starting point is to say that under a fossil fuel economy as it is today, people are poorer day after day. Corruption is bigger day after day, and so it's not that that renewable energies have a specific problem there. Actually, the fossil fuel based economy has possibly more negative externalities for communities than renewable energies. I mean, not probably. That is for sure, given the experience that the world has and the developed countries have with the fuel systems. We know that it only has generated the resource curse. We absolutely need strong regulatory and policy systems in place. We need actual oversight. We don't want the private sector to do whatever they want to make, for instance, a solar system in a local community that is unaffordable or just affordable to the chief. Everything needs to be subject to very, very strong rules and very strong oversight. That's the main thing to say. And then whatever we've been advising to these countries, in particular, we come from the field of extractive industries. Whatever we've been advising these countries in terms of avoiding the resource curse, in terms of putting in place the right institutions, remain very true. Even if we move into the renewable energy based economy, we do need a strong system to collect the taxes and not to allow collision of interest or tax evasion. We do need a system to properly spend revenues into the development priorities. We need strong rules to be respected and so on. So that's the main thing I would say. That I would say here. Sorry. Is there? Do you want us to address another question?
Another question related to the finance. When I looked at the report, I was struck by, it seemed like, gee, given Africa's enormous resources, that getting further money to finance this transition was, quote, easy or less formidable than I thought it was. But this question gets at that. It says Africa is already in an enormous debt crisis, and the green energy program also seems to push the continent into more debt. Are there ways
yes.
to grow locally or funds locally instead of running into yet another debt crisis?
Yeah, exactly. So I know actually the commissioner of the study, the African Development Bank, has been asking the same question. And here we echo the chief author here, who is Jeffrey Sachs. We should have said it. That study was written under his supervision, and Jeffrey Sachs is a full co-author to the study. Basically, what we've been saying under his guidance is that Africa has been going into terrible crisis, and the debt burden is so high. It's because Africa has been accessing debt that is short-term at a very high interest rate. Let's say 8 years at 9%. You cannot finance any development program with that time period and that debt maturity and that interest rate. So it means that this is a self-fulfilling prophecy. You know, we give Africa this type of debt, and then they go into crisis, and we say, oh, look, you are into crisis. How do you want to move forward and modernize and invest more and so on? So Jeffrey Sachs has been saying we need to change the debt system, and developed countries have been accessing debt at 1%, 0.5%. Why not developing countries, especially that the ODA comes from the developed countries? So there should be some rebalancing here of how the debt is being granted and assessed, and the risk being assessed. The other aspect of the story that Jeffrey Sachs has been fighting against is that credit rating agency, nearly by default, they will give a sub-investment grade to the continent, meaning that they have no choice but accessing the debt at a very high interest rate that will provoke all this liquidity crisis. Whereas what we're saying here is that if we have long-term debt with a low interest rate, that debt will be basically paid back easily by the growth of the economy, by the growth of GDP, by the growth of salary, so this is the way China, for instance, very low cost of capital, has developed itself and have lifted 40 million people out of poverty very quickly. This is what we're suggesting that the continent should do. Obviously, that this is not Africa. Africa is the victim here of the international financial system, and in some the international financial system to wake up. Now, there are some programs going on that are debt for climate swap, meaning we forgive debt, but in exchange there is a guarantee to invest the proceeds into climate action. There are some restructuring programs transforming short-term debts into long-term debts. There are various financing instruments that are being developed to get out of this liquidity crisis and this vicious circle of short-term high-cost debt, but it's going slowly.
Martin, if you don't have anything to add, I'll go on to the next question. And there's a bunch of next questions, but one that showed up recently that echoes in my worldview is a lot of what you're talking about is, and the client here for the receipt of this report is governments and what they can do. And so it's partly a top-down approach of what big funding, if there's offshore wind or major solar power, 100 megawatt facilities and stuff. And part of the problem seems to be that there's 600 million people without access to electricity. So from the bottom up approach, might involve microfinance for a homeowner or a neighborhood or a community to undertake the electrification of their homes, not for industry to power, minerals and mining and stuff. What do you see how that approach might work within the context of your work?
Happy to start offering an answer here. Maybe Perrine can complement. So I will first agree with you that the addressees of this work are essentially governments, are the African Union, the African Development Bank, but not because it's a top-down approach. I would dispute that characterization of our report. It's a macro approach. Let's call it macro, because it can't be top-down, and we acknowledge this in the report. It has to consider differences that are regional, that are country-based, or that are even subnationally determined on the types of energy that will be appropriate for zero carbon electrification in various corners of Africa, right? In some places, it will be offshore wind. In some places, landlocked countries, for example, offshore wind will not be a thing. Solar will be more of a thing in Northern Africa than in Southern African countries. Geothermal will be a big thing on the Africa Rift Valley. So it obviously has to count on national governments as well, identifying specific ways of how electrification is going to be conducted. And on a second level of even greater specificity, there is a need that we acknowledge in the report. There is a chapter on community participation and consent to these new energy processes and projects, and how they're implemented, making sure it's taking into account the views of traditional peoples, local communities that are not only affected by the investment project, but that will also benefit from the investment ultimately. And we take into account consultation processes and generally participation mechanisms for communities to be engaged in this process, precisely just so it's not a top-down approach, but a constructive effort across Africa. Perrine, maybe you want to add something?
So another question that I think it's in your report, but it won't hurt for you to respond directly to it. It says, is it possible for renewable energy to replace fossil fuels in Africa? What is your response to that very sort of point blank question, big overview question?
So Martin had a slide there showing the incredible potential of the solar potential of the continent, because it's, we are all over the world. We all know what sun is all about, right? But you need a specific intensity of sun of sun and a certain number of days during the year and certain number of hours during the day in order for that sun potential to become a real technical potential that you can tap into. And after the Middle East, Africa is second in terms of having this wealth of potential. Obviously, as Martin just said, North Africa, the Sahel region, this is where the biggest solar potential is. It's incredible. It could power most of the continent, but also, it's even possible, actually, if we could finance the interconnectors with Europe, it would also, it's a source of export of solar electricity to Europe. It's pretty impressive. So that gives a lot of hope. Obviously, there are obstacles, there are technical obstacles, economic, everything needs to be thought through, but we've done it for the fossil fuel economy, and actually it's a failure for the continent, let's say. Maybe the developed countries have managed it well, but the continent hasn't been really very lucky with taking advantage of the oil and gas potential that is also super quite complex to tap into. Why not for solar that is more widely available, that requires less capital and so on.
So thank you again. I have another question getting at the equity issue, and has to do with Africa being one of the least carbon intensive places on the planet in terms of the historical harm to the planet's atmosphere, et cetera, and holding them to the same standard, the same time frame might not sound fair. So, what is the question is, why is this requirement of zero carbon while the rest of the world has not reached this level of zero carbon? Is there, it's an equity question, which may not show up in our current economic accounting system. The bankers, et cetera, the people responsible for large sums of money that doesn't enter into their equations. But do you have a response to that issue?
I do have several responses. So first, you will see in our report an explicit mention that acknowledges that Africa is, of course, not responsible for the climate crisis. And the priority for African governments should be on dedicating resources for adapting to climate impacts and to building resilience to climate impacts. In the context of climate change, the energy transition away from fossil fuels, that should be the priority for governments, and also the entitlement, which we phrased in our report as a right of African countries supported by international law to receive financing from developed countries in technical support as well to address these issues facing Africa that are disproportionate. It's facing a disproportionate burden of climate impacts, considering how little it has contributed historically to the greenhouse gas emissions. But then we can park the climate issue to the side for a little bit and talk about the economics. The first answer as to, it's not I wouldn't say it's a requirement of zero carbon. It's a strategy for zero carbon electrification, because we see that it not only supports climate action goals, but it also makes economic sense in two ways that I see it. First, the alternative is worse. Fossil fuel-based development has caused environmental degradation all around the world, is causing environmental degradation in Africa, is causing social issues in Africa, is causing or creating opportunities for corruption in various African countries. The alternative is not better, right? The alternative to zero carbon is not better. It may look more economical if we disregard that there's a climate emergency that puts the survival of Africans at risk. Even if we disregard that, it may look cheaper depending on the oil price cycles. But ultimately, if you count for all the negative impacts that it has on local populations, socially, environmentally, and on the global climate system, fossil fuel development is not more economical than renewable energy development. And then the second, the counterpart to it, the alternative is bad. The actual investment in zero carbon energy makes economic sense because of the drop in costs, and because it would put Africa in a leadership position in low carbon sustainable development, as I put it on one of my initial slides here, to really leverage the other natural resources that Africa has in solar, in wind, in hydro, which I think I forgot to mention in my previous example. So it's really, regardless of what the rest of the world is doing, it makes sense. And then another layer, because of what the world is doing, the other countries are moving away from fossil fuel dependence. And if Africa keeps digging its feet more deeply into fossil fuels, another pun intended, it will become even more difficult for African countries. And we've seen with the slides on their fiscal dependence on these resources, right? If Africa continues to build dependence on those resources, then it will be more and more difficult to export them in the long term. We're not really planning for a sustainable here, both in terms of economics and environment, a sustainable development trajectory for African countries. So that's a draft of a response here.
So one other quick question has to do with the employment. And the renewable energy world will generate a lot of jobs. The question has to do with the other side of that equation, having to do with the people who are displaced or unemployed. If fossil fuel employment is going down, I don't know if your report has numbers of, how many thousands or hundreds of thousands, whatever it might be, people employed in oil extraction, gas, coal, whatever, the fossil fuel industry, and what will happen with them, in this transition. You can't just suddenly say, well, they'll start installing solar collectors on rooftops in neighborhoods and cities or something. But how do you see the transition for those human beings who are currently supporting their families in that part of the economy?
No, I mean, this is definitely a concern. This is what is underpinning the concept of just transition, right? It does require a government program to retrain them, to give them, maybe a compensation package at the beginning, and then to retrain them, to reinsert them in the renewable energy-based economy. They definitely need to be targeted by a program that is thinking about just transition. We have experiences in some parts of the world that have closed the coal mines. So we can, there is some inspiration to get, for instance, from Germany with the rural area. They managed to prevent from this area to fall into a terrible depression and downturn by retraining everyone, by turning it into both a tourism area and actually a high-tech area. We can say the same for Finland and Spain. So Europe has some experience to share it, or how it can be done in terms of direct cash transfer to compensate, but also in terms of macro policy to make sure that the economy of the area is being repurposed and people are being retrained.
Thank you. We have reached our limit of time, but there is one other question which I hope doesn't push things too far over the 12:45 limit. It's a question having to do, I think, with economic justice, equity, or whatever. And it has to do, you mentioned relaxing the AAA requirements. Why have those requirements been stringent on Africa countries in particular?
Yeah, that part is not on Africa in particular. Any bank in the world that has the mission to lend money has to have a AAA grading. So same for the international financing institution. But we should actually consider that they are not typical commercial banks. They have other mandates as well. And so then the donor countries that are behind it, that actually required to be paid back, right? At one point, this is the kind of philosophy. They should think again about relaxing that requirement imposed on the Multilateral Development Bank and the DFIs, and but it's not specific to Africa. It applies to any area of the world. It can be Latin America or Asia.
All right, thank you again. This was very informative. One of the things that was so impressive was your collection of information in your slideshow.